Vril stuff. We need to attain this. Like, look at all these blueprints that you have. This is great technology. The war, obviously, spoiler alert, doesn't work out well for the Nazis. And this Maria Orsic girl and the other followers of the Vril Society disappeared. In 1945, they're just gone. All trace of them are gone. Nobody could ever really figure out where they went. And the theory put forth was that they were able to get the Vril, and they were able to build the spacecraft that took them and possibly others to Aldebaran. So I had heard that story before. That's actually very popular, deep Nazi esotericism. How do you say that? I need to stop saying words that I don't understand. I mean, I understand. I have to stop saying words I can't pronounce. That was deep Nazi supernatural lore. And like I said, it's in a lot of popular culture. I had heard about the Vril Society, the Thule Society, growing up. Because it's an intriguing image of this high science fiction weaponry being crafted in laboratories and, being used in war. And maybe you had small units of U.S. commandos shooting Nazis and taking possession of this. They're like, what is this? It's some sort of hoverboard or something. I don't know. But anyways, so it's a very intriguing thing. 100% totally fake. There is no proof whatsoever that Maria Orsic ever existed. And when I was researching this, I was going into it looking for these groups that existed, never existed. Absolutely never existed. I'm like, are you kidding me? It was so disappointing. Not saying that I want the Nazis to have space-age weapons, but it was something that I didn't think they actually succeeded in getting space-age weapons, but I thought there was a group of people who were trying to get. They don't exist. There was no Vril Society whatsoever. Maria Orsic, they say her dad was born here and her mom was born here. We don't know their names. There's no photos of her. Well, let me rephrase that. There's one photo of a girl, and then there's drawings of a totally different girl. And depending on what website you go to, it's a different drawing or a different photo. Doesn't exist. That's why she disappeared after the war. Totally made up. And you're like, Jason, that, maybe the documentation, maybe. No, because she was actually the narrator of a fictional novel. She was the narrator of a book called, so after the fact, after she'd supposedly lived and died or lived and floated away to space, in 1960, a book came out called Morning of the Magicians. It's a collection of short stories, just conspiracy theories, basically. And it has the giants once ruled the earth. We've heard that one before. The Nazca lines are the giants making them, supposedly. It also includes speculations about German occultism and supernatural phenomenon. So it's completely made up, and that's where the Vril Society comes from. Vril, you go, what about the energy story? That also came from a novel. That novel was published in 1871, and it was called Vril, The Power of the Coming Race. It was a book about people living in the hollow earth and how great they were and how sucky humans were. Again, you can see the allure of the Nazi regime to that. These giant, great leaders of humanity were better than the subhumans above Earth, and everything they had was powered by Vril. So Vril was a completely made-up thing in a book. The Vril Society was a completely made-up thing. Maria Orsic, completely made up. There was no such things as any of those. It was very, very disappointing for me to discover that. Now, the Thule Society is real, but all they were was an occult group that believed in racial superiority. They may have been light 8 candles. Hey, Rudolph Hess, go say Bloody Mary. No, I'm not doing that. No, you gotta do it. It's part of stuff. They weren't summoning demons. They weren't making UFOs appear. They weren't doing anything cool. They were just being anti-cosmic Satanists in 1943. So I was disappointed. We know Vril doesn't exist. We know she doesn't exist. We know the Vril Society doesn't exist. And then you go, okay, Jason, but you said you changed your mind on this story. Did you believe it and now you don't? No, this is what was interesting as I was going through my notes. And I still believe that Maria Orsic doesn't exist and that the Vril Society never existed. And that Vril is fictional. So it strikes, 3 strikes. In 1947, Willy Ley, he was a German rocket engineer who fled Germany in 1937 again. Yeah, good foresight. In 1947, he published an article called Pseudoscience in Nazi Land. And he was talking about all the weird stuff that Germans believe. It's like, dude, these guys are nuts. So this is only 2 years after the end of the war. He did say, he goes, there's a bunch of weird groups over there. And he goes, there's a group that all they do is look for Vril, which is totally made up. It doesn't exist. He called them the Wahrheitsgesellschaft, or the Society for Truth. And he says it was just a group of people among all the other weirdo cults. So he was just talking about all these weird beliefs at the time. He says the Society for Truth did go around looking for Vril. So there were groups of people, there was a group of people who believed a fictional novel talking about Vril was real, and I think that was the end of it. He didn't name anybody in particular. The group name's completely different. I think from that, the authors who wrote Morning of the Magicians, which is all like the little tales and stuff like that, most likely read his article and elaborated on it, and that's fine. I just think it's ridiculous that now it's almost become common knowledge that, oh, the Nazis had this, were at least working on this high technology, and some people believe they actually achieved it. And they didn't, which, I mean, is good. So yeah, doesn't exist. You let me down, Wolfenstein. The Vril Society, Nazis flying to Aldebaran, living on the moon, doesn't exist. People think the Nazis went to Antarctica and we had like this huge war with them and they had this high technology there. No. History is interesting enough. History really is interesting enough. We don't need to add although that would be cool. Let's just stick to the facts. Let's just stick to the facts. Because then I discover it and I get disappointed. You don't want to disappoint me. I'm sad. Okay, so we're moving on to our next story. This story was something that I never ever considered. I didn't think it was a real thing. Platinum P on YouTube commented on, I believe it was on my Bigfoot episode yesterday, said, why don't you cover Mormon Bigfoot? And I responded because I'd never heard of it before and I will look into it. So I spent this morning looking into and assuming I'm going to find nothing. No offense, Platinum P. I figured that it was a real thing that you had heard about, but I figured it would be totally obscure. There are a ton of resources on Mormon Bigfoot. Now, this is what's interesting. It's not that Bigfoot himself is Mormon. It's the Mormons' theory on Bigfoot. So we're going to have to go back in time to start this story off. We're going to go back to the late 1800s. David W. Patton. So David W. Patton is Mormon, was Mormon, and he was one of the original leaders of the Mormon Church. Now, not like a founding member, but he knew Joseph Smith. This is his story of what happened to him one day in Tennessee. I couldn't find a date for this, but as I was riding along the road on my mule, I should put Western music in this part. As I was riding along the road on my mule, I suddenly noticed a very strange personage walking beside me. His head was about even with my shoulders as I sat in my saddle. He wore no clothing but was covered with hair. His skin was very dark. I asked him where he dwelt, and he replied that he had no home, that he was a wanderer in the earth and traveled to and fro. He said he was a very miserable creature, that he had earnestly sought death during his sojourn upon the earth, that he could not die, and his mission was to destroy the souls of men. About this time he expressed himself thus: I rebuked him in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by virtue of the holy priesthood, and commanded him to go hence, and he immediately departed from my sight. So that story, the reason why we know about that story was apparently he told that story to his buddy, Lycurgus Wilson. Lycurgus Wilson wrote a letter to another guy named Abraham Smoot. Abraham Smoot was writing a biography about David W. Patton in 1900. So the first time that this story came to light was in 1900. Now, Bigfoot sightings obviously had been around for a long time with the Native Americans. But even among Westerners, Bigfoot sightings were very, very, 1800s, early 1800s. So it would make sense that he would, every area had a different name for him. Like in The Walking Dead, some people call them walkers and other areas call them biters and stuff like that, because they wouldn't have national communication lines. You should watch The Walking Dead, by the way. It's really good. Anyways, so this story, again, this is coming from a established member of the Mormon Church. One of the original guys. I'm using that term wrong, but he was highly, and he died a martyr for the Mormon cause. He was killed trying to rescue Mormons who had been arrested. And they shot him, like they had this charge, and he died, and Joseph Smith was like, this dude was dope, and we should always remember him. So it's like, this guy was OG Mormon. So he tells this story that he supposedly told this one guy, and then the guy wrote it. People were like, how do we take this? Now, the first thing that they do is they go, in the Mormon community, they go, okay, we really trust this guy. We trust this whole chain of people. He might have met Bigfoot. And Bigfoot may have been Cain. So, the story of Cain and Abel, it's Bible class, guys. It's Bible class time. Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam, worker, and Cain was like a total dick, never did anything. And he was really jealous of his brother. So one day he picks a rock up and just bashes his brains in, kills him. It's not true, but some people consider it the first murder. Obviously there had been murders before that, we'll get into that in a second, but so he just bashes his brother's brain out, and God shows up. Like, voice in the sky, burning bush, however, he just is there, and he says, what have you done, dude? You're covered in your brother's blood. Your brother cries out from me from the ground, which is creepy, actually. So do, like, corpses go, help, God, get me out of here. So then God says, now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth up to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. And then God says, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out of the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. There's been a lot of, this particular passage has been, the whole Bible's been analyzed over and over again. The first question is, if Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel, but how does Cain go to a city? Like, he's headed out to Nod, and he ends up having a wife and having kids and stuff like that. And that's, again, always the pushback. The Bible is not a scientific textbook. It is not a genealogical tree of the entire planet. It is a religious history and a religious text of a particular people. So don't go to it looking for scientific questions. There were a ton of other people in the area, obviously, if Cain is able to leave and have a family and it not be his sister. That little rant aside, that's where they're getting this idea that he has to wander the earth, nobody can kill him, and the mark is the hairiness. And since he can't till the land, since the land is dead to him, how else would you feed yourself? You would just have to walk through the forest and eat squirrels and stuff, eat berries. You could never be in any sort of industrialized society, especially back then, an agrarian society, because you'd be cursed to not have anything grow. 2, nowadays, people would be like, dude, you're 7 feet tall and you're hairy. Where are you supposed to work? McDonald's? I can't have you behind the counter. You might be able to work in a call center, depending on how he smells. David W. Patton had that encounter with whatever it was. Maybe he made it up, but let's assume that this actually happened. And like anything, when something pops up that's kind of weird, there's generally the religion mainstream will take it one of 2 ways. They'll either go, that's a quaint story, but let's not get out of hand with that. And other people will say, this guy is so high up in the church and he was well respected, we should give it some veracity. And the story was just kind of there for a while. There was something people would talk about as kind of a weird part of Mormon lore. Like, did David W. Patton really see Bigfoot? He's on a horse and the guy's as tall as he is and he's covered in hair. So years later, in 1969, the president of the church at that time was President Kimball. He wrote a book called The Miracle of Forgiveness, and he used that story in that book. So more than 100 years later, about 69 years later, actually. So 69 years later, he used that story, and he's the president. So the president of the Mormon Church is basically the Mormon Pope. Like, they actually receive visions from God, and they can change certain laws. They can say, you know what, we're going to allow this. We're going to allow you to drink caffeine now. I just got a message from God, and he says we can drink caffeine. Just got a message from God. We can start dancing. So they are